The room went dead silent when she stepped out of the supply closet, and Natalie Hayes knew exactly why. They'd called her the quiet one for 20 years at Mercy General in Savannah, and that was fine. That was better than fine. Quiet meant invisible. Invisible meant safe. She adjusted the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, a habit now, a tick, and checked the pediatric ward's medication cart. Third shift inventory showed 3 narcotic counts off by 0.5 milligrams each. Not an error. Deliberate. Someone was testing the system, or someone wasn't paying attention, and in a hospital that treated 847 children a month, neither option was acceptable. Natalie marked it in a log with her small, precise handwriting and moved on. The other nurses barely glanced at her. Mrs. Chen by the desk, the new resident who'd arrived 2 weeks ago, didn't even acknowledge her as she passed. That was fine too. The fluorescent lights buzzed their constant, hollow rhythm above the linoleum floors. Natalie could see her own reflection there, a 42-year-old woman with silver creeping into her dark hair, wearing scrubs 2 sizes too big to hide the scar tissue mapping her left shoulder. Her hands were steady as she moved through the ward, checking vitals on sleeping children, adjusting for drips, reading charts with the kind of attention most people reserved for classified documents. A 5-year-old in room 4 had a dosage calculation error on his antibiotic. The resident had prescribed 22 milligrams per kilogram when the safe range for his age was 15 to 18. Natalie left a polite note on the chart. By evening, the resident would correct it without ever knowing someone had caught his mistake. That was how she operated. Quiet. Invisible. Helpful in ways no one had to acknowledge. She didn't tremble. Not in public. The trembling came in the mornings, exactly 3 seconds after she woke up, and lasted just long enough for her to grip the bathroom sink and breathe through the muscle memory of sand and screaming. Then it passed. By the time her first coffee was brewing, black, always black, never cream, her hands were steady again. 20 years of practice. 20 years of learning how to bury things so deep that no one could see them moving underneath the surface. The Baghdad streets had taught her that. The field hospitals near Camp Lejeune had reinforced it. And Mercy General, this quiet pediatric ward in Georgia, had perfected it. The ER doors burst open at 11:22 a.m., rubber wheels squeaking against tile in a rhythm that cut through the morning routine. Commander James Ryland pushed a wheelchair with the kind of precision that told Natalie immediately he was military, back straight, movements economical, the chair aligned perfectly parallel to the admission desk. In the chair sat an 8-year-old boy with his father's dark eyes and a blanket pulled up to his waist that didn't quite hide the rigidity of his lower body. Paralyzed. She didn't need the chart yet to know what had happened. The tension in the father's jaw, the careful way he positioned the chair, the boy's fixed stare straight ahead instead of taking in the new environment, these were the tells of a spinal injury. Recent. Within days, probably. "I need a pediatric trauma surgeon," the commander said to the intake nurse, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from giving orders to people in boots. "My son was hit by an SUV 4 days ago. Fractured spine. L4 and L5. His lost function below the waist. I was told by the trauma center in Atlanta that we needed to get to someone who specializes in pediatric cases. Someone good. Your hospital was recommended." The intake nurse, a woman named Jessica who'd been at Mercy General for 6 years, smiled and started the paperwork. "We have excellent pediatric specialists. Let me get someone to take Matthew back to an examination room, and we'll get him assessed immediately." Matthew. That was his name. 8 years old. Natalie caught sight of a small action figure in the boy's grip, a superhero of some kind, red and gold, and watched as his fingers tightened on it. That was fear talking. That was a child trying to hold on to something that made sense in a world that had just stopped making sense. Natalie pulled up the chart system on the nearest terminal and began entering the preliminary information as the nurses wheeled Matthew toward Pediatric Trauma Bay 2. 23 years of medical practice should have made this routine. It wasn't. Something in the commander's eyes, that particular desperation mixed with military composure, triggered something in her chest that she'd spent 2 decades learning to suppress. A child in a wheelchair. A father who'd already decided this was a problem that could be solved with enough money, enough authority, enough determination. She recognized that look because she'd worn it once, in a bombed-out school in Baghdad where 7 children had been buried under concrete and she'd had to choose which ones to save first. She didn't get to choose. That was the part the medals didn't mention. Dr. Sterling appeared in the hallway like he'd been summoned by the scent of a potential patient with active military insurance. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Natalie made in a month, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes and the kind of confidence that only came from never having his authority questioned. He moved past her without acknowledging she existed, which was exactly how she preferred it. To Dr. Sterling, she was the background, the wallpaper of the hospital, competent enough to not fire but invisible enough to ignore. Commander Ryland. Sterling extended his hand, and his voice shifted into a different register, the one he used for important people. I'm Dr. Marcus Sterling. I'm the head of our pediatric surgical program here at Mercy General. I heard about your son's situation, and I want you to know that you've come to the right place. We have resources that most hospitals simply don't have access to. The commander shook his hand, and Natalie watched the brief flash of hope cross his face. That was the mechanism. That was how it worked. Give the desperate man something that looked like a solution, and he'd believe anything. Sterling led them toward his private office, his hand on the commander's shoulder in a gesture that was just slightly too familiar, just slightly too proprietary. Natalie followed at a distance, not following, exactly, just moving in the same direction because that was where Pediatric Trauma Bay 2 was located. She needed to complete the intake assessment. She needed to read the detailed charts from Atlanta. She needed to understand what they were working with. What she heard instead, through the partially open door of Sterling's office, made her stop walking. The Nexus Protocol, Sterling was saying, and his voice had dropped lower, more confidential. It's an experimental surgical intervention program that we've been developing here at Mercy General for precisely these types of injuries. Pediatric spinal cord damage, paralysis, cases that conventional medicine has written off as permanent. We've had remarkable results. Natalie's jaw tightened. She didn't move. She simply stood there, 2 feet from the doorway, and listened. The program isn't available everywhere, Sterling continued. It requires a significant financial investment, the surgical team, the specialized imaging equipment, the post-operative care protocol. We're looking at approximately $340,000 for the full treatment course. Most insurance doesn't cover experimental procedures, so families typically need to be prepared for out-of-pocket costs. However, there may be some flexibility in how we structure the billing, depending on the circumstances. Flexibility in billing. That was a phrase that made Natalie's hands want to shake. That was the language of someone who was about to make a calculation that had nothing to do with what was best for an 8-year-old child and everything to do with what would best serve Dr. Sterling's bottom line. What kind of success rate are we talking about? The commander asked. She could hear the strain in his voice now, the underlying current of a man who would sell everything he owned to fix this, who would move mountains if it meant his son could walk again. Approximately 34% of patients show significant motor recovery, Sterling said. The number was so specific it felt real. It probably was real. That didn't mean it was honest. Of course, those are the cases where we could intervene early, where the families were able to commit to the full protocol immediately. In cases where there's been a delay, and 4 days is significant in spinal cord injury, the numbers are less optimistic. But we've had some remarkable outliers. It's worth trying, wouldn't you say? Worth trying. That was a different phrase entirely. That was a phrase that translated to, I will take your money and your hope and I will use both to make myself important, and if it doesn't work, I will have already been paid. Natalie moved away from the door before anyone could catch her listening. She continued down the hallway toward Pediatric Trauma Bay 2, where Matthew Ryland was being transferred onto an examination table by 2 nurses, the action figure still gripped in his small fist. The boy's legs didn't move when they shifted him. His eyes didn't change. But his breathing quickened, and his fingers went white around the toy. She approached the bed slowly, the way you approached a frightened animal. "Hi, Matthew," she said, and her voice came out in the tone she reserved for scared children, soft, steady, the kind of calm that came from having survived worse. "I'm Natalie. I'm going to help your doctors figure out what's going on with your spine. That means some tests, some machines that make noise, but nothing that hurts. Can you tell me what you remember about the accident?" Matthew's eyes moved to meet hers, and she saw the exact moment something shifted in his expression. It was the same look that kids got when they recognized that at least one adult in the room wasn't lying to them. "A truck," he whispered. "It came really fast. Dad pushed me out of the way, but I fell and I couldn't. I can't feel my legs." Natalie placed her hand on his shoulder, careful, light. "I know. But we're going to take good care of you. I promise." She didn't say it would fix things. She didn't promise miracles. She just promised presence, and sometimes that was the most honest thing you could offer. What she didn't say, what she couldn't say in front of the nurses and the intake staff and the machinery of a hospital that was already calculating profit margins, was that she'd seen this before. She'd seen desperate families and surgical recommendations that looked good on paper and 8-year-old children who deserved better than to be turned into funding sources for someone else's reputation. But that wasn't her job. Her job was to keep her head down, read the charts, and be the invisible one who caught what everyone else missed. The trouble was, Natalie was very good at her job. The break room at Mercy General smelled like burnt coffee and the particular desperation of people who hadn't eaten since rounds began. Natalie sat in the corner chair, the one by the window overlooking the staff parking lot, hands wrapped around a lukewarm cup of tea. She wasn't drinking it. She was listening to the fluorescent lights hum their electric monotone above her head. Dr. Sterling entered with the kind of presence that made the room contract. Not because of authority, though he wore that like a tailored suit, but because of the way people stopped whatever they were doing and waited to see if he'd target them. The attending physicians looked up from their sandwiches. 2 residents froze mid-conversation. A nurse practitioner suddenly became very interested in her phone. "Gentlemen, ladies," Sterling began, his Ivy League accent crisp as fresh hospital corners. "I need to discuss the Ryland case. Young Matthew. 8 years old, military family, spinal injury with significant functional loss." He paused, letting that hang in the air like a diagnosis. "The Nexus protocol is our best option. Experimental, yes, but cutting-edge technology. The Randolph family saw remarkable improvement, 72% functional recovery in their quadriplegic daughter." Natalie had read the Randolph case. 6 months post-procedure, that daughter had developed severe neuropathic pain and required opioid management. The literature buried that in methodology footnotes. Sterling had probably never read past the abstract. Dr. Morrison, the senior attending, cleared his throat. "The family's military insurance will cover it. Premium rates," Sterling confirmed. "Nexus Medical Group handles all coordination. My consulting fee," he caught himself. "My speaking honorarium is minimal. This is about patient care." Natalie's jaw tightened. Speaking honorarium. 500 words in a conference room, $15,000 deposited to a professional consulting account. She'd seen the schedule in the insurance processing system. For pediatric cases in 6 weeks. All experimental. All profitable. Actually, Natalie said quietly, the recent meta-analysis in the Journal of Pediatric Neurology shows only 4% improvement in cases with complete spinal transaction, and 17% of patients experience secondary complications. The room went still in the way rooms do when someone has just made a social error. Sterling turned to look at her, and his smile didn't waver, which was somehow worse than if it had. "Thank you for that input," he said, his voice warm as hospital antiseptic. "Let's make this interesting. I'm offering a wager." He turned to Morrison and the other attending physicians, his eyes bright with the kind of confidence that came from never being told no in an operating room. I'm betting $500 our little Florence Nightingale here quits within a week. Any takers? The silence that followed was the sound of someone's career being offered up as entertainment. Morrison shifted. Dr. Hayes, the junior attending, looked at his lunch. Neither of them took the bet, but they didn't defend Natalie either. Sterling hadn't really expected them to. This wasn't about the wager. This was about establishing the hierarchy. Natalie set her teacup down. Carefully. The way you place something breakable on a surface you know will hold it. She rose without looking at Sterling and left the break room. Behind her, she heard Sterling laugh, that smooth, practiced sound of a man who'd never encountered actual resistance in his life. That afternoon, the cafeteria was crowded with the usual chaos of a teaching hospital at lunch. Natalie carried her tray past Sterling's table, tomato soup, turkey sandwich, small juice box, moving with the deliberate invisibility of someone practiced at occupying space without demanding acknowledgement. She'd learned that skill a long time ago, in places where being noticed by the wrong person meant your name ended up on a casualty report. Sterling stood abruptly. His elbow came up in a motion that could have been accidental, could have been anything except what it actually was. Her tray lifted. Tilted. Fell. The sound was louder than it should have been, porcelain bowl cracking against tile, liquid spreading, sandwich landing soup side down. Scattered applause from two residents sitting 3 tables over. The kind of applause that comes from fear and the need to align yourself with power before power decides you're expendable. Sterling dropped a patient chart at her feet. A thick one, Matthew Ryland's preoperative workup. The paper scattered into the spreading puddle, corners curling as tomato soup saturated the edges. "Pick that up, sweetheart," Sterling said, his voice pleasant as a clinical note. "Unless you've decided you're too important for the grunt work now." Every eye in the cafeteria had turned toward them. Natalie could feel the weight of their attention like pressure on her sternum. This was the moment. This was the test. She took one measured breath. Just one. Pulled the oxygen down slow, felt her diaphragm expand, counted the expansion like she was monitoring a patient's vitals. Her training kicked in, not the medical kind, but the other kind. The kind they'd given her in places where composure under pressure meant the difference between a successful extraction and flag-draped coffins. A single tear escaped her left eye. Just one. It tracked down her cheek in a perfect line, not from fear, not from anger, but from the absolute clarity of understanding that this man had no idea what he was standing next to. That his entire system of power was built on the assumption that quiet people were small people. She knelt slowly, gathering the pages. Her hands were steady. The trembling wasn't fear. The trembling was restraint, the kind that comes from having held a child's compound fracture steady while rounds of fire snapped overhead in the Jolan district. From having applied pressure to abdominal wounds with the same mechanical precision she was using now to collect soggy documents. As she rose, she met Sterling's eyes without breaking contact. Wiped the tear away with the back of her hand in one smooth gesture. When she spoke, her voice was perfectly modulated, perfectly calm, the voice of someone who'd given orders in the dark while explosions lit up the night sky. "I've knelt in better men's blood, doctor," she said. "This is just paperwork." She turned and walked away, spine straight, tray abandoned, while Sterling's smile froze on his face for just a moment, that microsecond where the certainty flickered and something in his expression suggested he'd glimpsed something beneath the quiet, beneath the scrubs, beneath whatever story he'd constructed about who she was. But the moment passed. By the time she disposed of the spilled soup, he was already on his phone. That evening, while Natalie sat in her Honda Civic in the Mercy General parking lot, Sterling was in his office on the 4th floor, windows overlooking the historic district of Savannah, making calls. The first was to Dr. Harold Chen, chair of the Nursing Credentialing Committee, who owed Sterling a favor from a lawsuit Sterling's testimony had settled in Chen's favor. The second was to a board member Sterling played golf with monthly. The third was to an investigator with credentials that barely cleared legal standards but came with no questions. Natalie didn't know any of this yet. She sat with the engine running, watching the hospital lights reflect off the wet parking lot. It had rained while she was inside, one of those sudden Savannah downpours that came and vanished without warning. The rain drummed against the windshield like someone trying to get in. She pulled out her phone, opened the photograph she'd taken of the insurance documents, the consultation fee schedules, the enrollment patterns. The numbers were clean. The fraud was obvious. A 3-year-old could trace it backward to Sterling's account. What she couldn't trace was how to report it without someone asking where Natalie Hayes had come from. Why her military service record dead-ended into a wall of redacted files. Why her previous employment history consisted of a single reference from someone who no longer technically worked in the civilian world. Her phone buzzed. A text from her daughter Maya, waiting in aftercare, "Mom, when are you picking me up?" followed by a thumbs-up emoji. Natalie started driving toward the school, hands at 10 and 2, following every traffic law with the precision of someone with something to protect. By the time she pulled into pickup lane at St. Catherine's Academy, Sterling had already filed 3 separate complaints with hospital HR. One about insubordination. One about suspicious gaps in employment history. One about her hostile approach to evidence-based medicine, which was administrator speak for she contradicted me in front of colleagues. Maya climbed into the passenger seat, soccer bag in her lap, still wearing her school uniform. She was 12 years old with her mother's dark eyes and her father's habit of watching people carefully before deciding whether to trust them. She studied Natalie's face for exactly 3 seconds before asking, "You okay, Mom? You look scared." Natalie forced a smile, the kind you use for children because children can sense the absence of genuine warmth but at least can be temporarily fooled by muscle memory. "Just work stuff, baby. Complicated day." "The doctor guy? The one who's mean?" Natalie didn't remember mentioning Sterling to Maya. That was what happened when you forgot to compartmentalize, when the work started bleeding into the home, when the vigilance followed you out of the hospital and into your personal space. "We'll be fine," Natalie said, which was neither a lie nor the truth. It was a prompt for Maya to stop asking questions. Maya, being 12 and loving her mother, complied. Back at the hospital, Commander James Ryland was noticing something that had escaped Sterling's attention. His son Matthew's vital signs had stabilized dramatically in the past 18 hours. His pain scores had dropped. He was sleeping better. That morning, Natalie had adjusted Matthew's post-operative medication protocol without being asked, catching an interaction that Sterling's charting had missed, a combination of anticoagulants and NSAIDs that was unnecessary and potentially dangerous. The commander, who had spent 23 years in the Marine Corps and could read institutional loyalty the way other people read facial expressions, began asking questions. Quiet questions. The kind that don't show up in official record requests. Meanwhile, Natalie's resume was being pulled apart by 3 separate HR investigators, each one looking for the gap that Sterling had so carefully highlighted. Her work history showed 12 years of employment scattered across military medical facilities, names and locations that appeared in no civilian database, under systems that didn't exist anymore, in records that had been classified and then archived and then filed under security protocols that made civilian HR departments head spin. One investigator, a woman named Patricia Reeves, made a note in her file: applicant's background does not reconcile. Military references are legitimate but inaccessible. Previous supervisor listed as Colonel Michael Braxton, Joint Special Operations Command, but no JSOC phone number exists on record. Recommend further investigation before making employment determination. It wasn't even noon the next day when Natalie was called into HR. Not by Sterling. He was being careful about that. Instead, it was by the hospital's director of personnel, who explained that there were some inconsistencies in her background that needed clarification, and that pending further review, she was requested not to work pediatric cases. "How long will this review take?" Natalie asked quietly. The director looked uncomfortable. "We'll expedite it. But given the sensitive nature of the allegations." "What allegations?" "Insubordination. Gaps in your employment record. Questions about your ability to provide patient-centered care in a clinical environment." Natalie understood then. Sterling hadn't just made a move. He'd activated an entire network, board members, investigators, credentialing committees. All the machinery of institutional power, all of it moving in one direction, all of it fueled by $500 and wounded ego. She stood, collected her personnel file from the director's hands, and walked out of the office. That evening, Natalie sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, staring at nothing in particular, waiting for her daughter to come home from school. The kitchen window faced north toward the salt marshes that bordered Savannah, and the light was beginning to change in that particular way it does when the day is starting to quit. Maya came home from school, dropped her backpack, and found her mother sitting exactly where she'd left her that morning. "Mom." Maya's voice had changed. Lost its lightness. "Why are you home? It's only 3:30. Natalie turned to look at her daughter, this small, capable person who'd been born into a life where mothers disappeared and came back changed, where questions went unanswered because the answers existed in classification files, where home was just the place you tried to stay normal. "I'm taking a few days off," Natalie said. "Work stuff. Nothing for you to worry about." Maya knew a lie when she heard one. But she also knew that some questions didn't get answered, so she did what she'd learned to do. She set down her backpack, found some snacks, and sat at the kitchen table across from her mother, providing the kind of silent support that only the children of warriors understand. Outside, the rain began again. The rain had stopped by midnight, leaving the parking lot slick and reflective under the sodium lights. Natalie sat in her car for 20 minutes before driving home, her hand steady on the wheel, her breathing measured. The suspension notice had been delivered by email while she was finishing her shift, effective immediately, pending investigation into her credentials, her background, her very existence compressed into a human resources folder. She didn't cry. She wouldn't give Sterling that satisfaction, not even in the privacy of her own mind. At home, she'd found her daughter asleep on the couch, laptop open to a homework assignment about American heroes. Natalie had closed it gently, covered her with a blanket, and moved to the kitchen table where the light wouldn't wake her. That's where her mother found her at 2 a.m., staring at nothing, a cup of cold coffee gone pale as fog in front of her. No words were necessary. Her mother sat across from her in silence, the kind that only people who understand loss can offer. Outside, the rain began again, not falling but drifting, patient as a siege. Natalie had taken a personal day the next morning, her first absence from Mercy General in 18 months. She sat in a hospital cafeteria anyway, because hiding would be another kind of surrender, and she'd spent enough of her life learning how to be invisible without choosing it. She ordered tea and toast and opened her laptop, pulling up the digital file she'd obtained through a contact at the medical records department. It took her 17 minutes to find the problem. The Nexus protocol consent form Sterling had been distributing to desperate families bore a particular signature, a streamlined procedure outline promising spinal nerve regeneration through targeted stem cell injections combined with electromagnetic stimulation. The efficacy rate cited in the document referenced 2 clinical trials, one from Johns Hopkins, one from Mayo Clinic. Natalie cross-referenced both studies on her phone, her fingers moving with the precision of someone who'd spent a decade reading medical literature in field conditions where mistakes meant body bags. The Johns Hopkins trial showed a 12% improvement rate in motor function recovery. 12%. The Mayo study, more recent, reported 9%. The consent form Sterling was distributing claimed 68% efficacy. She took screenshots, made notes, and felt something shift in her chest, not anger, not fear. Recognition. She'd seen this before, in different uniforms and different languages, in contracts signed by men who counted bodies the way accountants counted money. Financial incentive creating medical fiction. She'd stopped it in Baghdad when she could. She would stop it here. The next morning, she arrived at Mercy General at 6:53 a.m., 19 minutes before rounds began. She was still technically suspended, but no one had thought to revoke her badge yet, and the night shift nurses didn't look closely at anyone moving with purpose through the pediatric ward. She'd spent 2 hours printing her documentation, side-by-side journal articles, the actual efficacy data, a timeline of Sterling's accelerated recommendations, and a summary titled, Concerns Regarding Protocol Integrity, written in clinical language so precise it could cut glass. Dr. Sterling arrived at 7:15, coffee in hand, his Italian loafers clicking against the tile with the rhythm of a man who'd never questioned his own authority. He was laughing at something on his phone. When he looked up and saw Natalie standing in Matthew Ryland's doorway, his expression didn't shift much, just a tightening around the eyes, a microscopic recalculation. She was suspended. She shouldn't be here. The fact that she was meant something had changed in his calculations. Rounds began in the large conference room, the attending physicians filing in like jurors, and Natalie stood at the back, her documentation in a folder the color of old bone. When they reached Matthew Ryland's case, she stepped forward. Her voice, when she spoke, carried no apology. The Nexus Protocol consent materials contain inaccurate efficacy data, she said. The room went quiet in that specific way hospitals go quiet, not silence, but the held breath before impact. The Johns Hopkins trial documented 12% improvement rates. Mayo Clinic reported 9%. The consent form circulating in this hospital claims 68%. Those numbers don't reconcile. Dr. Sterling's jaw tightened. He didn't speak. That was interesting. Additionally, Natalie continued, sliding the printed documents onto the conference table. The timeline for this patient's preliminary mapping procedure represents acceleration beyond the protocol's own recommended interval. Standard protocol calls for 72 hours of baseline neurological assessment. This patient is being scheduled for procedure within 48 hours of admission. The attending physician, Dr. Reeves, a careful man who'd trained in pediatric neurosurgery before administrative costs pushed him toward desk work, leaned forward. He picked up the documentation without looking at Sterling. Where did you get the Mayo data? Directly from their clinical trials database. Published 8 months ago. Anyone with institutional access could verify. Sterling's voice, when it came, moved like a knife finding its target. Perhaps we should discuss this nurse's recent credentialing concerns instead of her editorial opinions about medical literature she's not qualified to interpret. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. One of them was blinking, had been blinking for weeks. Natalie had noticed it every shift, that a rhythmic stutter like a nerve misfiring. I'm qualified to read peer-reviewed data, Natalie said. Her hands were flat on the table, palms down, steady as surgical instruments. I'm qualified to recognize when a procedure timeline is clinically unjustified. And I'm qualified to voice concern when a child's welfare might be compromised by financial incentive rather than medical evidence. Sterling stood up. His chair scraped backward with a sound like bones grinding. You're suspended. You shouldn't be in this hospital. Security can escort you out, or you can walk. Your choice. Natalie didn't move. The commander deserves to see this data before signing the updated consent form. The consent form is legal and binding. The procedure is scheduled for tomorrow, 0800 hours, preliminary mapping protocol phase 1. The boy's father understands the risks and benefits, and he's signed the authorization. This meeting is over. He turned and walked out, his shoes clicking like a countdown. Dr. Reeves looked at the documentation in his hands, then at Natalie. I'll contact Johns Hopkins. If this checks out, we need to halt the schedule and revise the protocol. Natalie nodded once and left the conference room. She didn't go home. She went to Matthew Ryland's room instead, where the boy lay in his hospital bed with the particular stillness of children who've learned that moving causes pain. He was 8 years old. He had his father's eyes, alert, tactical, assessing danger. The paralysis from his T12 spinal fracture meant sensation ended at his waist, but his mind was still firing on all cylinders, still trying to problem-solve the problem of his own body. Hey, Matthew, Natalie said, pulling the chair close to his bed. How are you feeling? My dad says the doctor is going to fix my back tomorrow. His voice was small. Is it going to hurt? Natalie considered lying. She'd spent 2 decades in environments where lying about pain was kindness. Instead, she said, "I don't know yet. But I know your dad loves you more than anything in the world. And I know that you're the bravest person I've met in a very long time." Matthew's lower lip trembled. He was 8. He was supposed to be worrying about math tests and soccer camps, not whether his spine could be reassembled by a surgeon running on financial incentive and ego. "What if I never walk again?" His voice cracked like thin ice. Natalie reached out and squeezed his hand. "Then you'll have the strongest arms in Savannah, and people will move when you tell them to move. Either way, you survive. That's what your family does." She said nothing about the procedure being postponed. She didn't know if it would be. She only knew that she'd handed the evidence to Dr. Reeves, and now she waited for the institution to either protect its own or protect its patients. In her experience, those two needs rarely aligned. That evening, her phone rang at 7:43 p.m. It was Dr. Reeves. His voice was quiet, measured, the voice of someone who'd just spent 3 hours making phone calls to Johns Hopkins and discovering that every concern Natalie had raised was accurate. "The procedure is postponed pending protocol review," he said. "And I've called the commander. He's meeting with me and the hospital administrator at 0800 tomorrow." After he hung up, Natalie sat on her porch with a cup of tea that steamed in the Savannah humidity, her hands wrapped around the ceramic like it contained warmth she needed to preserve. She thought about Sterling, what he'd do when he realized his carefully constructed narrative was collapsing. Desperate men were predictable. They escalated. They reached for their phone and called the people who owed them favors, the board members and administrators and lawyers who formed the scaffolding of his power. He had institutional gravity on his side. He had tenure and connections and the particular invulnerability that comes from being useful to people who matter. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that tomorrow, Sterling would realize Natalie had known. She'd walked into rounds with documentation prepared like ordnance, and she'd detonated it in front of every attending physician in the hospital. She'd made him look reckless. She'd made him look like a man who prioritized profit over a child's welfare. She'd made him look incompetent. And he would spend the rest of his career finding ways to make sure she paid for it. But first, he had to try to save face. And men like Sterling always tried to save face before they got desperate. They calculated. They strategized. They assembled their power and they waited to see if the damage could be contained. Natalie understood the pattern because she'd seen it in command structures, in the careful dance of institutional self-preservation. Tomorrow's meeting would determine if Sterling was finished, or if he was just getting started. She finished her tea as the light bled out of the sky, turning the trees into shadows of themselves, and felt something that hadn't touched her in months settle across her shoulders like a weapon being drawn from its holster. Not fear. Not anger. Recognition of the battlefield, and acceptance of what came next. The monitor screamed. Matthew's oxygen saturation tanked first, 94, 89, 72, the numbers plummeting like a body falling from a building. Dr. Sterling stood frozen at the operating table, his hands suspended over the open surgical field, his face the color of old concrete. The child's blood pressure collapsed next. 120/80 became 80/50 in the span of 3 seconds. The cardiac anesthesiologist barked orders nobody was prepared to execute because Sterling wasn't moving. Natalie was in the hallway outside the OR, supposedly relieved of clinical duties pending investigation, when she heard the alarm. That sound. That specific tone. She'd heard it in forward operating base Shank in Logar province, in the blast ward at Al Yarmouk Hospital in Baghdad, in field hospitals where the difference between life and death was 60 seconds and a clear head. She was moving before her brain caught up to her body. The OR nurse tried to block her. "You're suspended. You can't. Step aside." The voice that came out of Natalie wasn't the deferential nurse from pediatrics. It was the one that had commanded a trauma bay through a firefight that killed 3 Marines in the hallway outside. The OR nurse stepped aside. Matthew's chest was open. The pericardium, the membrane around the heart, was swollen tight as a drum, blood accumulating inside the sac, crushing the organ with every beat. Cardiac tamponade. The heart suffocating in its own blood while Sterling stood paralyzed and the monitors screamed toward flatline. 14-gauge needle, Natalie said. Not asked. A command. Someone handed her the needle. She moved to Matthew's second intercostal space, found the landmarks in the silence where her hands knew the anatomy better than her eyes could register. Midclavicular line. The needle went in clean, precise, a puncture that belonged in an anatomy textbook. The hiss of air escaped, then fluid, then a rush of dark blood from the pericardial sac. Decompression. Immediate. The pressure released from the child's heart like a fist unclenching. The monitor's pitch changed. Lower. The oxygen saturation climbed. 95. 100. Blood pressure rose as if someone had thrown a switch. Matthew's body remembered how to live. Call cardiothoracic, Natalie said quietly. Tell them tamponade, emergency intervention in hallway, patient now stable for transfer to ICU. Nobody moved. Now, she said. The attending who'd been watching the procedure, a woman named Morrison who'd seen Natalie in action for 3 years without understanding what she was watching, moved fast. A phone materialized. Words were spoken. Things began to happen with the precision of an orchestra that had just found its conductor. Matthew was moved to the ICU on a prepared bed. His vitals stabilized. His oxygen stayed above 95. His heart, damaged but beating, continued. Natalie stepped back into the hallway before anyone could thank her. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered with an electric hum, and somewhere in that building, Dr. Sterling was already calculating how to survive what he'd just witnessed. The phone call started within an hour. Sterling, running, burning every connection he'd built over 23 years at Mercy General. He called his golf buddy, the hospital CEO, a man named Richard Bancroft who owed Sterling 40% of his patient referrals. "We have a compliance crisis," Sterling said, his voice perfectly calibrated between urgent and controlled. The suspended nurse performed a major invasive procedure she isn't trained for. Scope of practice violation. Lawsuit waiting to happen. Bancroft's voice came back, tight, worried. How bad? Bad enough that we need to document immediately. Get HR risk management. Board notification. This needs to look controlled. The second call went to the state nursing board. Sterling had a contact there, an investigator named Patricia Chen who'd consulted with the hospital on previous credential disputes. "I need you to accelerate an investigation," Sterling said. A nurse on staff performed unauthorized procedures beyond her scope. Pediatric case. "I'm concerned about her entire credential history." Chen didn't know Sterling was describing an emergency pericardiocentesis that saved a child's life. She just knew the word unauthorized and the word pediatric, and those words opened files. The third call was to risk management, where Sterling planted a seed. The procedure happened without attending supervision. She performed it in a hallway. That's not just scope of practice, that's reckless. We need to be prepared for a lawsuit from the family. By 8 o'clock that evening, Natalie was called to a fourth-floor office where 3 people sat behind one desk like a firing squad arranged for efficiency. HR Director Patricia Voss. Risk Management Counsel, a thin man with the personality of a budget spreadsheet. The hospital's Chief Medical Officer, Dr. James Reeves, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. The suspension letter was already printed. Pending investigation. Unauthorized procedure. Scope of practice violation. Her badge was requested. She placed it on the desk without argument, without emotion, without the tremor in her hands that would have told them she was anything other than compliant. "We'll contact you when the investigation concludes," Voss said carefully, as if the words might shatter something. Natalie nodded once and left. The drive home took 18 minutes. She sat in the driveway for another 11, hands still steady on the steering wheel, breathing the way they'd taught her in combat medicine training, slow and measured and so controlled it felt like betrayal. In the house, she made tea she didn't drink. She showered to remove the hospital smell. She sat at the kitchen table in civilian clothes because civilian clothes were all she was allowed to wear now, all she was permitted to be. Her daughter Maya came home from school at 3:15. Found her there. Just sitting. "Mommy, why are you home early?" The question was innocent. Simple. A child noticing that the world was wrong in a way she didn't have words for. Natalie pulled her onto her lap, and the question cracked something open that she'd kept locked for 23 years. "I helped a little boy," she said quietly. "I helped him stay alive." "That's good," Maya said, the way children do, with absolute certainty. "You always help people. That's what you do." Sometimes helping people makes other people angry. Maya's face creased with confusion. "But why?" "You saved him." Natalie had no answer. She held her daughter while the tears came, not the controlled tears of someone managing their emotions, but the breaking kind, the kind that came from watching the system protect a predator and punish the person who'd stopped him from killing a child. She cried because Maya would grow up in a world where that was how it worked. She cried because she'd spent 23 years staying invisible to stay safe, and the moment she'd revealed who she was, she'd lost everything anyway. Maya held her and asked no more questions, just stayed, the way children do when love is all the logic required. Meanwhile, 37 blocks away, Commander James Ryland sat in a coffee shop across from a man named David Halloway, a private investigator he'd worked with on 3 overseas security contracts. On the table between them was a folder containing everything Ryland had found about Natalie Hayes' background, which was almost nothing. "Her nursing license is clean," Halloway said. "But it's only 8 years old. Before that, nothing. Not military service. Not work history. Not so much as a traffic ticket. It's like she materialized in 2016. Ryland stared into his coffee. "What about before Montana?" "Dead end. No social media footprint prior to 2014. No college records. No employment history. It's a constructed life, sir. Professional construction. Someone gave her that identity and made sure the old one disappeared." Ryland had spent 2 decades in marine intelligence. He recognized witness protection when he saw it. He recognized someone who'd been erased. But no federal program erased someone that thoroughly for working in a pediatric ward. They erased people because of what they knew. Because they'd seen something. Because they'd done something that mattered. He thought about the way she'd moved in that emergency. The authority. The certainty. The way trained surgeons had obeyed her without question. He thought about a 12-year-old girl waiting in a hospital room for her father to come back and tell her that her brother would walk again, and a nurse who'd already saved the boy's life before his surgeon even understood what was happening. "Keep digging," Ryland said. "Whatever she's hiding, she hid it to protect people. Find out why." 3 days later, a new patient arrived in the ICU at Mercy General, gunshot wounds, refugee status, identified in the system as Karim al-Azawi. Nationality, Iraqi. Previous residence, Fallujah. Current status, asylum granted based on intelligence cooperation. And Natalie, suspended, was called back for 1 shift because the ICU was hemorrhaging staff and apparently even fired nurses could work if the hospital was desperate enough. When she entered Karim's room to check the monitor lines, his entire body went rigid. His eyes locked on her face. Recognition crashed through his features like the shock wave from an explosion. He whispered something in Arabic. "Al-Dil," he said. "The shadow." The words came in a whisper, exhaled like a prayer in a language that hadn't crossed Karim al-Azawi's lips in 6 years. The shadow. His body went rigid against the ICU bed rails, monitors spiking as recognition flooded through him, the kind of recognition that belongs to people who have stared into the face of death and found salvation instead. Natalie turned from the 4 pump, her hands steadying as they always did, and in that moment something shifted in the room's pressure, the air itself seeming to recognize what was happening before anyone else's mind could catch up. He was crying now, this man with 7 bullet wounds and a refugee's papers, his voice breaking between Arabic and English. Senior Chief. Senior Chief Petty Officer. The way he said it wasn't a question. It was a declaration, a man identifying a legend he thought he'd never see again. Dr. Reeves stepped closer, confused, but Karim's eyes were locked on Natalie with the kind of intensity that comes only from survival. You were at Al-Salaya. The school. The children in the basement. His hand reached out, trembling, and Natalie didn't pull away. She let him hold her wrist like it was the anchor keeping him tethered to this world. The story spilled out in fragments, each piece a brick in the wall that Sterling had been desperately trying to keep standing. Karim was 12 years old when the bomb fell. He'd been in that basement with 47 other children, huddled in the dark for 2 days while fighting raged above them. The Iraqi military had locked the doors from the outside. The rubble was impassable. The children were starving. And then a woman in blood-soaked scrubs had come through the wall, literally through it, cutting through concrete and twisted rebar with tools that weren't meant for construction, because protocol said the doors were sealed and protocol was how people died. She carried out 3 at a time, Karim whispered, his voice shaking like a man reliving the moment. Under fire. Snipers on 3 rooftops. She never stopped. Never once. He looked at Natalie with the reverence of a man witnessing a resurrection. You saved 32 of us. I was one of the youngest. You gave me water. You told me my mother was waiting. Dr. Reeves stood frozen. The ICU nurses had stopped working. The monitors beat their steady rhythm into an impossible silence. The door to the ICU opened, and it wasn't an orderly or a resident. It was a man in dress blue so sharp they could cut, a SEAL team operator's bearing written into the angle of his shoulders, his face carrying the kind of calm that comes from having made peace with violence long ago. His name was Mitchell Graves, a decorated SEAL team leader, and he walked directly to Natalie with the kind of purposeful stride that made security instinctively step back. When he spoke, his voice was parade ground steady, each word landing like a gavel. 2 silver stars. He paused, letting that settle. Karim's hand squeezed Natalie's wrist. 3 bronze stars with Valor. Another pause. The breathing in the room had synchronized, everyone inhaling together. And a Navy Cross. His voice didn't rise, but it filled every corner anyway, the way a radio signal finds every frequency at once. Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes. Operation Buried Angel. 47 children. 200 American lives protected because of intelligence you gathered while conducting rescue operations under active fire. Natalie stood motionless, her expression unchanged, but the room had transformed around her. Dr. Reeves was pale. One of the younger nurses had her hand over her mouth. The ICU felt smaller somehow, compressed by the weight of classification levels being shattered like glass. An FBI liaison appeared next, a woman in a dark suit with credentials that actually meant something, the kind of credentials that made hospital administrators sit down. She carried a folder sealed with red tape, the kind of documentation that belonged in vaults. Senior Chief Hayes's military records were deliberately erased from public databases following Operation Buried Angel, she said, her voice clinical and cutting. She was ordered to disappear into civilian life for source protection. The operation could not have succeeded without operational security so complete it bordered on legend. The insurgent network that held those 200 American personnel never identified her. Not once. She looked directly at Sterling, who had suddenly materialized in the doorway, his face going the color of hospital walls. That security is about to become very public. The 2-star Marine general arrived exactly 7 minutes later, the kind of timing that suggested military precision was still running the show. He was smaller than Sterling by 3 inches and broader by a gulf that couldn't be measured in centimeters. He moved through Mercy General like he was walking through his own command center, which, in a sense, he was. His name was General James Whitmore, and Commander Ryland had called him with a kind of favor request that worked only when you'd saved a man's life, which is exactly what Natalie had done. The general found Dr. Sterling in the physician's lounge, the space suddenly too small for all the people who'd crowded in behind him, staff members, administrators, 2 MPs in dress uniforms, and every camera the hospital had frantically tried to call away once they realized this wasn't going to be a quiet internal matter. Sterling's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. His jaw worked like a calculator that couldn't solve the equation in front of him. The general's voice was level, the kind of level that comes only from men who've given commands that sent soldiers into fire. Dr. Marcus Sterling, your medical privileges at Mercy General Hospital are terminated effective immediately. You will surrender your credentials and identification to hospital security and exit the building. Sterling tried to speak, his words tangling. You can't. This is a hospital. You have no authority, but the general was already continuing, his voice never wavering. Furthermore, the Department of Defense is filing formal complaints with the Georgia Medical Board regarding fraudulent billing practices affecting military dependents. The Nexus Protocol consent forms containing falsified efficacy data have been secured as evidence. 7 pediatric patients. $105,300 in undisclosed payments routed through a shell corporation in the Cayman Islands. The CEO appeared, flanked by 2 security officers, his face carrying the expression of a man watching his career opportunities evaporate. Dr. Sterling, you're terminated. Please leave the building now. Sterling's face went purple, actually purple, the capillaries in his temples standing out like they might burst through skin. He tried to argue. He tried to invoke board connections. He tried to claim the general had no jurisdiction. But the cameras were rolling, phones were recording, and every staff member in that lounge was watching the moment his entire architecture of power collapsed like a building designed by someone who'd never studied physics. Security escorted him out, his protests echoing down the hallway, his perfectly styled hair falling across his forehead as he clawed at the edge of authority one last time. It didn't hold. 6 months later, the pediatric physical therapy room at Mercy General smelled like eucalyptus oil and determination. Matthew Ryland stood between parallel bars, his legs still weak from disuse but responding, firing, remembering what muscles were supposed to do. He was 8 years old and he was walking. Not because of an experimental protocol, but because traditional therapy worked when given proper time, because his corrected medication regimen had reduced inflammation by 52%, because Natalie had designed his recovery plan while suspended and waiting for her name to be cleared. She stood beside him, one hand ready but not hovering, positioned like someone who knew exactly when to catch and when to let go. Commander Ryland watched from the doorway, tears streaming down his face, the kind of tears that belong only to men who thought they'd lost something and found it again. Matthew was laughing, the sound of a child who'd forgotten he was supposed to be sad about his circumstances, and when he reached the end of the bars, he threw his hands up and shouted her name. Miss Natalie! I did it! I did it all the way! She high-fived him, their hands connecting with the crack of genuine celebration, and in that movement her jacket shifted. The lining, worn cotton, old enough to have faded from whatever color it started as, revealed a patch. A unit patch from the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse Company, Baghdad 2011 to 2012. The same unit patch that hung framed in the Ryland family living room. The same one Commander Ryland had worn when he was a captain coordinating with embedded medical personnel. The same one Natalie had been carrying next to her heart for over a decade. Dad, look, Matthew said, pointing at it with the unself-conscious clarity of children. She has the same thing you do. Commander Ryland stepped forward, his hand reaching out to touch the patch, and in that moment something passed between them, not words, because words were too small for it, but understanding. She'd been carrying his unit with her. She'd been carrying all of them with her. Every operation, every mission, every child who'd survived Al-Salaya, every American who'd been protected by intelligence she'd gathered in the dark under fire. She'd never taken off that patch, never let them go, never allowed herself to forget the weight of what she carried. Natalie was offered the position of Director of Pediatric Emergency Medicine 3 weeks after Sterling's termination went public. She accepted on the condition that she could still work bedside shifts, that she would never become someone whose hands forgot their own practice. The hospital built her a new wing of the pediatric ward, named it for Operation Buried Angel, and installed a small memorial wall with photographs of the soldiers whose lives had been saved by classified work finally brought into the light. Dr. Marcus Sterling found employment at Savannah Community College, teaching CPR to board students for $13 an hour, his medical license suspended pending investigation in 3 states, his house in foreclosure, his name permanently attached to a fraud investigation that would follow him like smoke. The laughter that had once echoed through Mercy General's corridors had stopped. It never came back. But that wasn't the final scene. The final scene was Natalie in the pediatric ward, new director's embroidered patch on her scrubs, still worn at the edges because she'd had them made like her old ones, nothing pretentious, kneeling beside a crying 5-year-old who was terrified of needles. She was speaking softly, eye level, letting the child hold her hand while the four was placed. The girl's mother watched from the doorway with the kind of expression that says she was watching someone who understood fear in a language deeper than most people spoke. Maya, Natalie's daughter, had started telling people at school that her mom was a hero. She said it with the certainty of 12-year-olds, the kind of certainty that comes from seeing someone you love finally recognized for what they've always been. Karim Al-Azawi, recovered and working as a translator at Mercy General, nodded respectfully when Natalie passed in the hallways. She paused at the memorial wall one afternoon and touched the plaque the hospital had installed in honor of Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes, Navy Cross, who reminds us that healing is the highest form of courage. She touched it once, then returned to work. You do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, I want to hear about it. Subscribe for more stories about quiet heroes who change the world without asking for recognition. Like this video. Comment below, have you ever judged someone only to find out you were dead wrong? Let's talk about the power of second chances and the people who've earned them.